Lee Jae-ho stood in the crowded Busan orbital spaceport, his old eyes struggling to read his ticket. At 72, his retirement cruise was supposed to be simple. After working for decades as an engineer, he wanted to relax and see the stars. Now boarding, luxury cruise to Saturn's rings, announced a pleasant voice over the speakers. Jae-ho looked around, confused by the many signs and moving walkways. His hearing aid beeped with low battery, making the announcements sound muffled. People rushed past him from all directions. "Excuse me," he asked a young man in uniform. "Where is gate 23? The worker pointed vaguely to the left before hurrying away. Jae-ho nodded and shuffled in that direction, pulling his floating luggage behind him. The corridors all looked the same, gleaming white with blue lines on the floor. He followed a blue line, thinking it would lead to his gate. When he reached a boarding area, Jae-ho saw a sleek white ship through the large windows. It looked more advanced than the cruise ships in the brochures, but he assumed they had upgraded since the pictures were taken. A distracted worker scanned his ticket without looking up. "Wrong gate, but system accepts your credentials. Proceed to boarding," the worker said, eyes fixed on another screen. Jae-ho walked through the connecting tube into the ship. Inside, he was surprised by how clean and professional everything appeared. There were no decorations or signs of entertainment, only smooth white walls with blue trim. He didn't see other elderly passengers, just young women in matching Navy uniforms moving with purpose. "This doesn't look like a cruise ship," he muttered to himself. A woman with short black hair and intense eyes noticed him. "Sir, this is a restricted area. How did you get aboard the Stellar Artemis?" Before Jae-ho could answer, an alarm blared. Red lights flashed along the walls. "Emergency launch protocol activated," announced a computerized voice. "All personnel secure for immediate departure." "Wait," the woman shouted into her wrist communicator. "We have an unauthorized civilian aboard. Delay launch." "Cannot delay," replied another woman's voice. "Departure sequence already initiated by mission control. Solar flare approaching. Launch window critical." Jae-ho felt the ship vibrate beneath his feet. The woman grabbed his arm and pulled him to a seat along the wall. "Strap in," she ordered. "I'm security officer Han Damai. You've boarded a research vessel, not a cruise ship." Jae-ho's face paled as he fumbled with the safety straps. "I made a mistake. I need to get off." "Too late for that," Damai said grimly as the engines roared to life. The acceleration pushed Jae-ho back into his seat. Through a small window, he watched the spaceport shrink rapidly until Earth itself became a blue marble, then a distant point of light. His retirement cruise was taking an unexpected turn. Later, in a conference room, Jae-ho faced 30 women in Navy uniforms. Their name tags showed they were scientists, engineers, and specialists. The oldest looked about 45, the youngest barely 25. Captain Kim Soo-jae stood at the head of the table, her stern expression making Jae-ho shrink in his seat. "Mr. Lee," she said, "you have boarded the Stellar Artemis, a long-range research vessel on a classified mission. How did you get past security?" "My ticket was scanned," Jae-ho explained. "The worker said something about wrong gate but right credentials. I thought it was my cruise ship." Chief Engineer Park Jae-yun checked her tablet. His retirement ID must have been cross-registered with our Science Ministry clearance. The system saw his engineering background and approved him. "Well, Mr. Lee," said Captain Soo-ji, "we have a serious problem. We can't turn back." Science Officer Yoon Mi-kyung stood up. "Captain, we need to discuss the drive malfunction." The room grew silent. Captain Soo-ji nodded slowly. "Mr. Lee, we planned to tell the crew once we were farther out, but you should know too. During launch, our FTL drive experienced a critical failure. We're off course. Can we fix it?" Jae-ho asked. "The drive is damaged beyond repair," explained Engineer Park. "We're on minimal power, headed toward the nearest outpost with communication capabilities." "How long will that take?" Jae-ho's voice trembled. Captain Suji met his eyes directly. At our current speed, approximately 10 years. The room erupted in shocked voices. Jae-ho felt dizzy. 10 years. He would be 82 if he survived that long. What about rescue? Asked a young scientist. Our emergency beacon was damaged in the drive failure, said Communications Officer Choi Eun-ah. We're effectively invisible to Earth tracking systems. Jae-ho looked around the room at the 30 women who would now be his only human contact for a decade. Their faces showed shock, fear, and determination. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This is my fault. Captain Suji shook her head. No, Mr. Lee. The drive would have failed regardless of your presence. The mission was rushed due to political pressure. I'm an old engineer, Jae-ho offered. Maybe I can help somehow. We have 30 of the brightest female scientists in Asia, said Security Officer Han Damai with a frown. No offense, but what could you offer? Engineer Park studied him. What systems did you work with before retirement? Life support, mainly. Old Earth orbital stations and early Mars habitats. A few of the women exchanged looks. Actually, said Engineer Park, our life support systems are based on those early designs. Your practical experience might be useful. Captain Suji nodded. Very well. Mr. Lee will be assigned quarters on Deck 4 and will consult with engineering as needed. She stood up. Ladies, this mission has changed, but our commitment hasn't. We will survive this journey together. As the meeting ended, Jae-ho wondered how an ordinary retired engineer would fit among these brilliant young scientists for 10 long years in deep space. His peaceful retirement cruise had turned into the greatest challenge of his life. The first month aboard the stellar Artemis was lonely for Jae-ho. He spent most of his time in his small cabin, a plain room with just a bed, desk, and tiny bathroom. The crew avoided him, seeing the old man as an unwanted problem. When he walked the corridors, conversations stopped. In the dining hall, no one sat with him. They blame me, he told his reflection as he combed his thinning white hair. Maybe they're right. His only regular visitor was a service robot that brought meals and collected his laundry. He named it Buddy, though it never responded to the name. One night, as Jae-ho slept, alarms screamed throughout the ship. He jumped up, confused, as red emergency lights flashed. The ship's voice announced, "Environmental failure on Deck 3. All personnel implement emergency protocols." Jae-ho opened his door. Crew members ran past, some wearing breathing masks. "What's happening?" He called to Security Officer Han Damai as she hurried by. "Life support failing in the main lab," she answered without stopping. Jae-ho followed her, moving as quickly as his old legs allowed. He reached the observation room above the main lab and found several crew members watching through the glass. Below, engineers in protective suits worked frantically on an open panel. Captain Suji stood nearby, her face tight with worry. "How long until complete failure?" 2 hours, answered Chief Engineer Park, studying a tablet. "The backup system isn't engaging, and the main regulator is overheating." "What about the specimens?" asked a biologist. "They'll die first," said another scientist. Years of research, lost. Jae-ho moved closer to the window. He recognized the system they were working on, an advanced version of units he had maintained for decades. "Excuse me," he said quietly. No one noticed him. "Excuse me," he repeated louder. "I might be able to help." The room went silent as everyone turned to him. "Mr. Lee, this is a highly advanced system," Captain Suji said politely but dismissively. "Yes, but I see the problem." Jae-ho pointed to the panel. "They're trying to fix the computer control, but look at the conduit fitting. It's discolored. The problem is physical, not electronic." Engineer Park looked closer at her screen. "He's right. The temperature at that junction is rising even with power diverted." "Can we fix it?" asked the captain. "Not from the control panel," Jae-ho said. "Someone needs to go in and manually bypass that section." "That's too dangerous," Engineer Park objected. The heat levels are already critical. I did this kind of repair during the orbital station crisis of 42, Jeho said. I know how to approach it safely. Captain Sujai studied him. You're not part of this crew, Mr. Lee. I can't authorize you to risk your life. With respect, Captain, I'm already risking my life. I've been on this ship for 10 years. Let me be useful. After a brief discussion, they agreed. 15 minutes later, Jeho entered the lab in a protective suit, with Engineer Park guiding him through a headset. The junction is behind the third panel, she instructed. But be careful, the metal will be hot. The air in the lab felt thick and difficult to breathe. Sweat ran down Jeho's face inside his helmet as he removed the panel. The metal pipes behind it glowed red at one connection point. I see it, he said. The expansion valve is stuck. The pressure is building up. Can you release it manually? Asked Engineer Park. Yes, but I'll need to redirect the flow first. Is there any flexible conduit in the toolkit? Working slowly despite the dangerous heat, Jeho created a bypass around the faulty valve. His old hands moved with surprising steadiness, muscle memory from thousands of similar repairs guiding him. Flow redirected, he finally announced. The temperature should start dropping now. Within minutes, the environmental readings began improving. When Jeho emerged from the lab, exhausted but successful, the crew looked at him differently. You saved our research and possibly the ship, Captain Sujai told him at dinner that evening. Thank you. Engineer Park sat beside him, asking detailed questions about his technique. Others joined their table, curious about the old engineer who had solved a problem their advanced training hadn't prepared them for. 2 weeks later, Jeho had become a regular presence in the engineering section. Engineer Park had assigned him a small workstation where he helped maintain older systems. These coolant regulators have a design flaw, he explained to Kim Minji, a young physicist who had started spending time in engineering. They work perfectly in theory, but in practice, they vibrate slightly at certain temperatures. The manual doesn't mention that, Minji said, watching him adjust the fittings. Manuals are written by people who design systems, not people who fix them. Jeho smiled. Experience teaches different lessons than textbooks. As word of his practical knowledge spread, other crew members began coming to him with problems. Science Officer Yoon asked him to help stabilize her sensitive measurement equipment. Communications Officer Choi consulted him about signal interference in the older antenna systems. 3 months after saving the lab, Jeho was invited to join the weekly planning meetings. His seat was at the far end of the table, but it was a seat nonetheless. We're approaching an asteroid field, announced Navigation Officer Ba during one meeting. Standard procedure is to go around, but that would add 3 weeks to our journey. What if we go through it? Asked Captain Suji. The debris detection system isn't reliable enough, Engineer Park said. We could miss smaller objects until they're too close to avoid. Jeho cleared his throat. On the early Mars transports, we modified mining sensors to detect small debris. The technology is old but effective and uses minimal power. The room grew quiet as the officers considered his suggestion. Could we implement something like that? Captain Suji asked Engineer Park. With Mr. Lee's guidance, yes, she nodded. It might actually work better than our current system for this specific situation. Captain Suji turned to Jeho. It seems you found another way to be useful, Mr. Lee. Please work with Engineer Park to implement your solution. As the meeting ended, Jeho noticed several crew members smiling at him. That night, for the first time, he was invited to join a group for their weekly card game. We need an extra player, explained Minji. And Engineer Park says you know all the old card games we've never learned. 6 months after accidentally boarding the wrong ship, the old man was no longer just a passenger. He was becoming part of the crew. The small workshop on Deck 5 had slowly transformed over the past year. What began as a storage room now held workbenches, tools, and various projects in different stages of completion. Handwritten labels marked containers of parts salvaged from unused systems. The space smelled of metal and the special oil J-Ho had created when standard lubricants ran low. "Hold it steady," J-Ho instructed, watching as Kim Min-ji carefully joined two pieces of metal. "Don't rush. Let the heat do the work." Min-ji's forehead wrinkled in concentration as she guided the welding tool. 5 other crew members watched, waiting for their turn to practice. "Good," J-Ho nodded when she finished. "See how the joint is smooth? That will hold even under pressure." "I never thought I'd learn welding on this mission," Min-ji said, pushing her safety goggles up. "My doctorate is in quantum physics, not metalwork." "Yet here you are, making things with your hands," J-Ho smiled. "Knowledge is in your head, but skill is in your fingers." His workshop sessions had become popular among the crew. 3 times a week, he taught what he called practical arts, skills like welding, basic circuitry, mechanical repair, and improvisation with limited materials. Scientists with advanced degrees sat like students, learning trades that formal education had skipped in favor of theory and digital modeling. Captain Suji appeared at the doorway. "Am I interrupting?" Everyone turned. The captain rarely visited the workshop. "Not at all," J-Ho said. "We're just finishing today's lesson." "Mr. Lee, we need your expertise on the bridge," she said, her tone serious. "We've encountered something unusual." 10 minutes later, J-Ho stood with the senior officers, staring at the main view screen. A massive structure floated in space ahead of them, a geometric monument that seemed to be made of crystal and metal, reflecting starlight in beautiful patterns. "We detected it yesterday," explained Science Officer Yoon. "It's not natural. Someone built this." "Any signs of life?" asked J-Ho. "None," said Security Officer Han. "We've scanned it thoroughly. It appears ancient and abandoned." Engineer Park pointed to smaller screens showing detailed scans. "The structure contains technology, but nothing our systems recognize. That's why we wanted your perspective. You've worked with more varied systems than any of us." J-Ho studied the images. The monument was beautiful, geometric shapes flowing into each other, with what looked like circuit patterns embedded throughout. "Those patterns," he said slowly, "remind me of very old circuit designs, from Earth's early computing age." "That's impossible," said Officer Yoon. "This is nowhere near Earth, and those patterns would be from centuries ago." "Not exactly the same," J-Ho clarified, "but similar principles. See how these lines branch and reconnect. Early computers used similar layouts before quantum processing." Captain Suji made a decision. "We'll send a research team to examine it. Mr. Lee, would you join them? Your perspective might be valuable." 2 hours later, J-Ho floated beside Min-ji and Officer Yoon in a small research shuttle. Through the window, the monument loomed large, at least the size of 3 football fields. "It's beautiful," whispered Min-ji as they approached. The shuttle docked at what appeared to be an entrance. The team put on their spacesuits and entered the structure through an airlock. Inside, soft blue light illuminated corridors that seemed to be made of transparent crystal with metal inclusions. The walls were covered with intricate patterns that glowed faintly. "These are definitely circuit-like," J-Ho said, examining the patterns. "But I've never seen anything this complex." Officer Yoon scanned the walls with her equipment. "The metal elements are conducting energy, but we can't identify the power source." They moved deeper into the monument, recording everything. In a large central chamber, they found what appeared to be control panels, smooth surfaces with geometric indentations. "It looks like an interface," said Min-ji. "But how would it work?" J-Ho studied the panel. Something about the arrangement seemed familiar. "This reminds me of old analog controls. Not digital, not based on language, but on physical patterns." He gestured to different sections of the panel. "This area has circular patterns, maybe for navigation. These linear arrangements could be for power or resources." Officer Yoon looked skeptical. "You can tell that just by looking." Not with certainty, Jeho admitted, but I've worked with many different control systems. There are patterns in how intelligent beings design interfaces. Form follows function. Minji placed her gloved hand near one of the panels. Should we try to activate it? No, both Jeho and Officer Yoon said simultaneously. First rule of unknown technology, Jeho explained. Observe before interacting. They continued mapping the monument for hours. In one room, they discovered small artifacts, crystal objects with the same circuit-like patterns. We should take one back for study, suggested Officer Yoon. As they carefully collected samples, alarms suddenly blared from their suits. Movement detected outside the monument. Announced the shuttle's AI through their communicators. 3 vessels approaching. We need to return immediately, ordered Officer Yoon. They hurried back toward the airlock, samples secured in containers. Through the crystal walls, they caught glimpses of ships approaching, angular, aggressive-looking vessels unlike their research shuttle. Pirates, Minji whispered, or scavengers. Back on the shuttle, the pilot initiated emergency departure procedures. The scavenger ships fired warning shots that flashed past them. They want the monument, said Jeho, or whatever's in it. The shuttle raced back to the stellar Artemis, the scavenger ships in pursuit. On board the main ship, Captain Sujai called an emergency meeting. 3 hostile vessels are demanding we leave the area, she explained. They claimed the monument as their territory. We have no weapons, reminded Security Officer Han. We're a research vessel. Jeho thought back to his early days working on cargo ships. You don't need weapons to create a defense. All eyes turned to him. The old transport ships used to release clouds of metallic particles when pirates approached, he explained. It confused their sensors and created a screen to hide behind. We have metal samples in the geology lab, offered Minji. Engineer Park nodded slowly. And we could modify the external coolant release system to disperse them. Captain Sujai looked at Jeho. Will this work? It worked 100 years ago, he said. Basic physics hasn't changed. While the scavenger ships circled at a distance, the crew worked frantically to implement Jeho's plan. When the largest ship approached aggressively, Captain Sujai gave the order. The stellar Artemis released a cloud of fine metallic particles that expanded rapidly in space. The pursuing ship's sensors immediately showed confusion, their targeting systems unable to lock through the cloud. The Artemis slipped away while the scavengers were disoriented, carrying with it precious samples from the monument and detailed scans that would later prove invaluable to understanding the ancient civilization that built it. That night, in the mess hall, the crew celebrated their escape. Captain Sujai raised her cup to Jeho. To our mentor, she said, who teaches us that old wisdom still has a place among new stars. 5 years into their journey, the stellar Artemis had become more than a ship. It had become a home. Corridors once stark and clinical now displayed artwork created by the crew. The mess hall featured a small garden of herbs and flowers tended by Jeho, bringing color and fresh scents to their meals. Jeho sat on his favorite bench in the hydroponics bay, surrounded by growing plants. At 77, his movements had slowed further, but his mind remained sharp. His hair was completely white now, and he kept it tied back in a short ponytail, a style suggested by Communications Officer Choi that had amused the entire crew. Teacher Lee, a voice called. Only the youngest crew members called him this, a habit that had spread after Minji started it years ago. He looked up to see botanist Kang Subin standing awkwardly at the entrance. Though brilliant with plants, Subin struggled with people. Come sit. Jeho patted the bench beside him. What troubles you? Subin sat down, twisting her hands. I had another fight with Chun-hee. She says my experiments are taking too much power from her section. Jeho nodded. The ship's limited resources often cause tensions, especially between the passionate botanist Kang and equally determined physicist Chun-hee. Did you explain why you need the extra power? He asked. I tried, but she wouldn't listen. She just sees her work as more important than mine. Jeho picked up a small pot containing a plant with delicate purple flowers. See this flower? When I first planted it, it wouldn't grow. It kept wilting no matter how much water and light I gave it. Su Bin looked interested despite herself. Plants were the language she understood best. What was wrong with it? She asked. It needed company, Jeho explained. This species doesn't thrive alone. When I planted these smaller ones nearby, the main plant began to grow. He pointed to tiny white flowers surrounding the purple one. They share nutrients through their roots. Why should I care about her particle experiments? Because you're both connected through this ship's resources, just like these plants through the soil. Instead of fighting for your share, find ways to help each other grow. The next day, Jeho secretly smiled when he saw Su Bin sitting with Junhee at lunch, awkwardly asking questions about the physicist's latest experiment. These moments have become common over the years. The crew sought Jeho's advice not just for technical problems, but for personal ones. The oldest person on board had become a grandfather figure to 30 brilliant, but sometimes socially struggling scientists. The old man's magic, Security Officer Han called it after Jeho resolved a serious argument between the medical team and engineering staff about space allocation. Captain Sujai relied on him too, often inviting him to her office to discuss crew morale. Today was one such meeting. The scientists are getting restless, she told him, pouring tea into 2 cups. 5 years is a long time to be confined in space. Jeho accepted his cup with a nod. They need purpose beyond daily survival. Young minds need challenges. We've been collecting data and conducting experiments, but an urgent knock interrupted them. Navigation Officer Ba entered without waiting for permission. Captain, sensors have detected a planetary body nearby. It appears habitable. 3 days later, the bridge was crowded as the view screen showed a blue-green planet growing larger as they approached. Atmosphere contains oxygen, reported Science Officer Yoon. Temperature ranges are within human tolerance. There's liquid water. It's not Earth, but it's as close as we've seen. The implications hung in the air until biologist Iam broke the silence. We could stop here, she said quietly. Build a settlement instead of continuing for 5 more years. The room erupted in discussion. Some crew members argued passionately for landing, tired of the confined ship and uncertain journey. Others insisted they continue to the outpost, honoring their original mission. Captain Sujay raised her hand for silence. We will need to make a decision. I want everyone to consider carefully. We'll vote tomorrow. That evening, small groups gathered throughout the ship, debating their options. Jeho found himself approached by both sides, each wanting his support. You should vote to land, urged biologist Im. At your age, 5 more years in space. She didn't finish, but her meaning was clear. Jeho might not survive to reach the outpost. Later, Engineer Park found him in his workshop. Will you vote to continue? She asked. Our research could help millions back on Earth. Jeho didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, what do you see when you look at this ship? Engineer Park looked confused. Equipment. Systems. Home, I suppose. I see 30 brilliant futures, Jeho said. When I accidentally boarded this ship, I thought my life was ending. Instead, I found its true purpose, to witness your discoveries, to see what you will become. The next morning, the crew gathered for the vote. Captain Sujai invited each person to speak briefly before they decided. When Jeho's turn came, he stood slowly. I am the oldest here, he began. I have the least future ahead of me. By all logic, I should vote to land, to feel solid ground again before I die. The room was completely silent. But our mission was never about personal comfort. It was about advancing human knowledge. This planet will still be here for others to explore. The data we've collected must reach Earth. He looked around at the 30 women who had become his family. I vote to continue our journey, not for myself, but for what each of you might contribute to humanity if we complete our mission. When the final votes were counted, the decision was made. They would continue their journey, but would launch probes to study the planet as they passed. As the ship moved away from the habitable world, Jeho stood at a viewport watching it shrink in the distance. Captain Suji joined him. "Your words swayed many votes," she said. "They respect you deeply." Jeho smiled. "They made the right choice themselves. I just reminded them of who they are." "And who are we, Mr. Lee?" "Explorers," he said simply, "even when we're lost." The alarm that sounded through the stellar Artemis was different from any they had heard before. It wasn't the sharp warning of a system failure or the deep tone of an approaching object. This sound was gentle, almost musical. Jeho woke slowly in his cabin. At 82, his body needed more rest than it once did. His joints ached as he sat up, but he smiled at the sound. He had been waiting 10 years to hear it. "Communication signal detected," announced the ship's voice. "Earth frequency confirmed." The corridors filled with crew members, some still in sleek clothes, moving toward the bridge. Jeho followed more slowly, using the walking stick Minji had carved for his 80th birthday from spare materials. By the time he reached the bridge, Communications Officer Choi was already working at her station, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. Her eyes were wet with tears. "Signal strength growing," she reported. "We're being hailed." Captain Suji, her black hair now streaked with gray, stood tall behind Choi. "Put it through." The bridge speakers crackled, then cleared. "Research vessel Stellar Artemis. This is Outpost 7. We are receiving your automated beacon. Please confirm life signs." The crew erupted in cheers and cries. Some hugged each other while others simply wept. 10 years of isolation was ending. Captain Suji composed herself and pressed the communication button. "Outpost 7. This is Captain Kim Suji of the Stellar Artemis. We confirm 31 life signs aboard. We are requesting docking clearance and immediate relay of our status to Earth authorities." There was a pause. Then, 31? "Our records show 30 crew departed." Captain Suji looked at Jeho and smiled. "We gained one along the way. A very important one." Over the next few days, as they approached the outpost, news of their survival spread rapidly through human space. The Stellar Artemis had been presumed lost years ago. Their unexpected return and the scientific data they carried made headlines everywhere. "They're calling us heroes," Minji told Jeho as they shared tea in the hydroponics bay. "There are interviews scheduled for everyone once we dock." Jeho nodded. "You are heroes. The discoveries you've made will change science forever." Minji corrected firmly. "The discoveries we made. You're part of this crew, Teacher Lee." The outpost grew larger in their viewports, a spinning wheel-shaped station that would be their first contact with other humans in a decade. Medical teams were standing by, along with officials eager to begin processing the wealth of scientific data they carried. On the night before docking, Captain Suji called the entire crew to the mess hall. Tables had been pushed aside, and someone had made decorations from colored insulation material. A banner hung over the door. "Stellar Artemis, mission accomplished. Tomorrow, we rejoin human society," Captain Suji began. "Doctors will examine us. Officials will debrief us. Family members we haven't seen in 10 years will be waiting. It will be overwhelming." The crew nodded, faces showing both excitement and anxiety. "Before that happens," Suji continued, "I wanted us to have one last night together, just us, the family we became." She walked to where Jeho sat and extended her hand. Confused, he took it and allowed her to lead him to the center of the room. 10 years ago, Mr. Lee boarded our ship by accident." Suji addressed the crew. "Some of us saw him as a burden." She smiled at Security Officer Han, who looked down in embarrassment. "Instead, he became our most valuable crew member," Suji continued. "Not because of his technical skills, though those saved us many times, but because he taught us something no academy training could, how to be human during our longest, darkest journey. She turned to face Jeho directly. On behalf of the crew, I present you with this. Engineer Park stepped forward, holding a small metal disc. She placed it in Jeho's weathered hands. We made it from materials salvaged from the monument, Park explained. It's inscribed with all our names and a star chart showing our journey. Jeho's hands trembled as he held the gift. His eyes filled with tears. I boarded the wrong ship, he said softly, but found exactly where I needed to be. One by one, each crew member came forward to embrace him. Young women who had once avoided the strange old man now held him tightly, some crying, others whispering personal thanks. The next morning, the Stellar Artemis docked at Outpost 7. Camera drones hovered as the airlock opened. Medical personnel stood ready with floating stretchers, expecting weakened survivors. Instead, they saw 30 women in neatly pressed uniforms standing in formation. At their center stood an elderly man with white hair and a short ponytail, wearing the uniform that had been specially made for him years ago. Captain Sujai stepped forward to greet the outpost commander. The Stellar Artemis crew reporting successful completion of our extended mission. News of their return spread throughout human space. The scientific data they brought back, studies of the monument, samples from the habitable planet, and countless discoveries made during their journey, was hailed as the most significant collection of new knowledge in decades. At the formal reception on the outpost's observation deck, officials made speeches about courage and perseverance. When it was time for the crew to be recognized, Captain Suji insisted that Jeho stand with the senior officers. Our journey proves that space exploration requires more than advanced technology, she told the audience. It requires human wisdom, adaptability, and compassion, qualities our accidental crew member taught us every day. 3 months later, when they finally returned to Earth, Jeho stood at a viewport watching the blue planet grow larger. Minji joined him, now wearing the insignia of a project leader for the new Monument Research Initiative. "Are you excited to be home?" she asked. Jeho thought about the small apartment he had left behind 10 years ago. It probably didn't exist anymore. His few friends would have assumed he died long ago. "I am home," he said, gesturing to the ship around them. "My home is with my 30 daughters who flew among the stars." Minji smiled and took his arm gently. "And your daughters are taking you back to Earth to meet your grandchildren, the next generation of explorers who will learn from your story." As the ship began its descent toward Earth, Jeho thought about how a simple mistake, boarding the wrong ship, had given him the greatest adventure anyone could imagine. He had not just witnessed humanity's journey to the stars. He had become an essential part of it. Sometimes, he reflected, the wrong ship takes you exactly where you need to go.